Good morning, good afternoon, good evening, wherever you are. Welcome to this panel. This is actually the third of a series of discussion panels that the International Economic Association has organized under the general theme of diversifying economics globally. The first two were a set of presentations and perspectives from economists based around the world. And for this third one, we thought we would have representatives of research networks and leading journals, or editors from the leading journals, talk about sort of their perspectives on what some of the obstacles in opening up the discipline of economics around the world. We assume that talent is distributed and wildly dispersed around the world, yet the production of economic knowledge, certainly in terms of frontier knowledge, is very, very highly concentrated. We might think at first sight that this is related to lack of resources. There are rich countries and poor countries, and it's a lot easier to develop first-class universities and research networks in richer environments. On the other hand, when we look at what has happened over time, there has been a significant amount of income convergence around the world. Lots of countries around the world have done very well economically. And the relative standing of the United States and Europe has declined in terms of incomes. But we actually do not see a corresponding large improvement in the relative position of researchers and economists based in the rest of the world. Even in Asia, where obviously income gains have been quite striking, the proportion of authors and researchers based in East Asia in top journals or in journals more broadly has increased rather quite tepidly. And many other parts of the world, such as Sub-Saharan Africa in particular, are heavily underrepresented relative to their incomes. So that suggests that there's more going on than just some incomes, that are issues about networks, about clubs, about being able to have access to the right information, knowing how things work, asymmetric information, lots of hidden obstacles. And those are the issues that we want to discuss. We'll start. We really have a great panel. I really want to thank our panelists. We will start from two representatives, or really the presidents of what's probably the two leading research networks in United States and Europe, the NBER and the CPR. Let's start first with Jim Poterba, who's the president of the National Bureau of Economic Research. Then I'll give the word to Beatrice Weder de Mauro, who's the president of the Center for Economic Policy Research based in Europe. And then we will move to our journal editors. Those of you in the audience, if you have any questions, please put your questions in the chat box and try to keep your microphone on mute. With that, let's start with Jim.
Great. Well, Dani, thank you so much for convening this very timely and very important panel, and for helping all of us to focus a bit on these issues of broadening the diversity of the economics profession. This has been a topic, of course, of great interest within the United States, and I think the global focus that this panel brings is completely appropriate and a natural follow-on to some of what we've been discussing here. The NBER is in some ways an unusual platform from which to discuss the global integration of the economics profession, because it is by foundation a group that is focused primarily on US or North American economic activity. But it does have a number of activities that cut more broadly around the globe. And I think it may have some lessons for thinking about the diversity initiatives that you've teed up. And I thought I would try to draw on those in my opening remarks today. So I want to really try to just do some compare and contrast of some different initiatives that have been in place at the NBER and see what lessons they may suggest for trying to make these comparisons. I'm going to talk about two research projects, both of which were focused on global issues, two ongoing outreach initiatives that involve relationships, one in India, one in China, and then talk a little bit about some of the lessons from domestic diversity initiatives here in the US. So let me start on the first one by just mentioning two projects that took place at the NBER over the course of the last 35 years, both with a very clear goal of trying to bring together research communities thinking about global issues. The first one in the late 1980s was a project on emerging market debt. Time we'd had emerging market debt crises, and there was great concern about the role of emerging market debt in the global financial system. This is a project that was led by Jeffrey Sachs, and it brought together a set of researchers to look at and understand not just the general principles of emerging market debt, but also the circumstances in particular countries. Okay. Second project was something called African Success Stories, led by Sebastian Edwards and Simon Johnson and David Weil. And it basically took place in the latter part of the first decade of this century. And I know there were actually some participants from some of these projects who were here, including Dani Rodrik, who actually participated in the Emerging Market Debt Project. The two projects both were clearly designed to analyze and bring together information on what was happening in the emerging world. But they had a very different structure of how the project teams were set up. The Emerging Market Debt Project asked each of the research teams to include at least one member of the economics community, probably the academic community, in the home country that was being studied. And this included Bolivia and Argentina, Chile, a number of East Asian countries. The African Success Stories project did not have that focus. It rather was convening and trying to mobilize the North American research community to focus on issues around how macro policies and other policies had been successful in Africa. Both of these projects produced a series of volumes that I think today represent important contributions in the area, but I think they had different consequences in terms of building the human capital and trying to diversify the pool of researchers interacting, right? And the explicit design in the Emerging Market Debt Project of bringing together local home country teams and partnering them with researchers from, in this case, the North American continent, I think had a much larger impact in trying to help build some of those bridges that enable the intellectual exchange and provide the opportunity for building things forward. And I mention this because, this is a very simple design feature of the project. And it is something which is, to me, a lesson that we can take away that says, in the event that one is studying something which is an explicitly global topic, thinking about ways that the expertise from various countries can be brought together and the human capital can be partnered can be a very important part of what can be successful in initiatives like this. So I point to the contrast between those two very good projects, but with slightly different tweaks in the design that I think were consequential. Second example I'd like to talk about are two ongoing conference series that the NBER participated in for nearly 2 decades. Both of them launched in the latter part of the 1990s, one in China, one in India. The China project was launched by Shang Jinwei at Columbia. The India project initially launched by Raghu Rajan at Chicago Booth. Both of them were created with the goal of helping to expand the visibility of economics in those two very important countries for North American economic researchers. And they were both structured around an annual meeting, one hosted by a pair of think tanks in India, NCEPR and ICRIER, the other hosted initially by Beijing University, and then over time with a little bit more rotation of different places. So the interesting, and both of these projects I think have been very important in helping to acquaint researchers who were not otherwise familiar with either India or China about those countries. I can point to a number of examples in both cases where researchers, having gone to those countries for these conferences, came back having developed partnerships with academics there and launching new projects which were insightful and important. The one difference between the two that I would highlight here is the conferences in China were always held on the campus at PKU, and there was a PhD program operating there. And to be honest, there was always a little bit of local partnering between the Chinese organizers and the visiting academics from the NBER community, so that there would be a graduate student who'd be introduced to us and would sort of be able to, to help us navigate while we were visiting. My most happy memory of this is discovering that one night when we had dinner, my graduate student host and I had dinner at a restaurant that was near the university. And she explained to me that we had not gone to the restaurant next door, where there was a discount for the diners that depended on the number of Google Scholar citations that the diners had. So that was a piece of local culture that I certainly took away from my visit, which was great fun. But the important thing about this was that the partnerships between the graduate students and the visiting faculty, even though they were based mostly on 2 or at most 3 days of interaction, have had long-lasting consequences. I can count, at least half a dozen of the students who I met during those visits who I have stayed in touch with in one way or another and followed their careers. They've asked occasionally for advice. I think that was a really important part of networking. And of course, my experience, I think, can be multiplied by a number of others who were there. So the conferences in India were not held on a university campus, and they did not have quite the same opportunities for building the bridges. They were more focused on policymakers. They were both very successful initiatives, right? My point here is not to rank these one versus the other, but I think if our goal is to try to expand the human capital networking and to build things, to build bridges, that trying to get explicitly into the pipeline of graduate training, trying to make those connections, they can be very long-lived and very valuable. And I think that's an important lesson that I have taken from this. So the final thing I'll just mention briefly is a set of initiatives that we've done at the NBER focused on diversity within the North American economics community, trying to find faculty members and graduate students from minority serving institutions and other groups. One of these initiatives is actually a partnership with the Review of Economics and Statistics, and Rema has been very involved in this, in trying to bring faculty members from historically Black colleges and universities in the United States to attend the big annual meeting that we do in July called the NBER Summer Institute. And we've done similar outreach with the AEA Summer Program, which is designed to help students from underserved backgrounds and historically underrepresented groups to participate and see these meetings. And what I want to just mention is that I think that the first instinct I had thinking about these programs was we need to invite people to come to the meeting. And that's a good first step. That's helpful. But I think I've realized on watching this after a number of years that just getting people to the meeting is only a very small first step. And that what's really needed is to recognize that whether for reasons of culture or background or experience, that simply bringing someone who is not part of the network and saying, here, watch the network happen, is not quite enough. That we need to do more to be welcoming and inclusive and actually provide kind of the equivalent of the Michelin guide for you're here and now how does the network work and what's happening. So rather than, for example, in the NBER Summer Institute context, inviting 1 or 2 researchers to attend each of a number of different meetings in different field areas, when we have the opportunity to get back in person and in the future and move away from Zoom, my thought is that we want to in fact invite people to come in a small group and then do some network building and some coaching to explain that, this is what's going on at these meetings. You may sit in one of these seminars and hear people may sound to you like they're really attacking each other. But in fact, this is the way the network operates. And these folks are actually all friends and they're pushing their science forward. And I think beginning to do a little bit more of that kind of onboarding as part of these initiatives is a very important direction to go. And I hope that that is something which can be generalized. I think it probably has lessons for thinking about how we move outside just the North American context. And I think it's a setting in which I hope we can talk a little bit this morning about other initiatives. So let me close at that point and pass the virtual microphone to Beatrice.
Thank you, Jim. That's very, very helpful, and I'm glad you mentioned that late 1980s project on economic on debt and emerging markets, in which I co-authored the volume on Turkey, and I will just echo what you said, that it was even though I'm from Turkey originally, by that time I'd been spending. Of course, it was based in the United States, and being required to team up with a researcher in Turkey. And that was actually a very distinguished researcher, Merih Celasun, based at the Middle East Technical University in Ankara. That was incredibly useful for me as a researcher, among other things, learning how to do research in my own country. One of the things that still sticks with me is how, when we're going around to the National Statistics Office, is how you had to spend the first 20 minutes doing social chit chat and drinking tea before you could actually ask any questions about the availability of the data, which would have been my instinct. But of course, that's not the way that you get what you want. So with that, let's turn to Beatrice Weder de Mauro, who's the president of the CEPR. Beatrice.
Thank you very much, Dani. I did prepare a few slides, which I'd like to share with you. And I hope that you are seeing not what I'm seeing right now.
Yes, I don't think it's clear, but yeah.
It was green, but yes. now it is looking better. So yeah, thank you very much for inviting me to this very important conversation and this fantastic panel to be talking about it. So following from Jim, we do think about the CEPR as the European sister of the NBER. And in many ways, that is true because it is mostly European-based. But do notice, if you look at the name of CEPR, that the E does not stand for Europe, it stands for economic. And then there is a P in there, which is not in the NBER, which stands for policy. And both are significant because it means that the CEPR is both European and global, and very much interested. It is actually part of the DNA of the CEPR to do work on policy relevant issues, research-based always, but with a policy relevance. So the type of projects that Jim was talking about are very typical of something that the CEPR would be supporting or initiating. We have, for instance, the Geneva report on the world economy every single year. So clearly the remit of the research is not European only. What I want to talk about mostly is diversity within CEPR and how we have been trying to increase it. And it is mostly focused on the dimension of diversity, which is increasing the number of female economists, especially also at the top, which it means for us our research fellows. But starting with the CPR leadership, we also have quite a number of female economists, both in the academic and in the administrative leadership. In fact, I recall one time when we went to visit with a CEO and we came in force with 5 of us and all of us were women. He basically sat down a little bit shocked and asked whether any man could work at CEPR or not. So let me show you a little bit what has been happening in terms of our percentage of female research fellows per program area over the last years. And here you see the numbers as they have been evolving across the different program areas. So the financial economics, development economics, history, international monetary and finance, and the 2 macro programs, labor economics, IO, and public economics, and the newest program here that last 2 are new programs, political economy and organizational entrepreneurship. So you see that in all of these areas, in fact, the percentage has been increasing quite significantly. In some, we could even talk about a step change. And this did not just happen by coincidence. It did not just happen because the time was ripe, but there was a very intense conversation behind it with the program directors, a general recognition that women in economics are not doing as well as they should be doing, and that CEPR is one of the organizations that also should be doing as much as we can. It was a conversation, it was more attention around the nomination, around the appointments procedure, and ultimately also going back to the, after the appointments happened, going back to the PDs, a conversation about what did we do well, what didn't we do well, and ultimately also almost a little bit of a competition between PDs who felt like, oh my God, you know, my program area is not doing as well as others. So those are all elements of why we have been able to increase the share of female economists in all program areas quite significantly. Here, the last one, as mentioned, is a new one. So the increase here is not really important. Then in the same vein, we've had a strong focus on women in economics, and with, for instance, here a conference that was unfortunately virtual, was supposed to be in person with the European Central Bank, that shows how many females were involved and were happy to be involved, both more senior and more junior, and that's also an aspect in terms of lessons during these pandemic times. We've had a strong attention and a strong focus on the fact that the web-based type of economics that we are also having right here, be it from home or from your office, but just on Zoom, tends to be one that favors people who are already senior, who are already known, people who already have networks, and that we have to do much, much more for the young researchers and for the female researchers, for those who do not necessarily, who may be facing larger access hurdles, especially in times like these, when we know that women have been the ones who did also, on top of doing their research, try to take care of kids who may have been at home. So we had focus on over the last year, and we will continue to have a focus on this, and by organizing different types of new products in which female, more senior women and more junior women come together in forming new communities, a special seminar series that also, apart from presenting the research afterwards, also have a networking aspect. And that's one of the things that Elaine Rain has been running very successfully, and I'm convinced that is a keeper beyond pandemic times. And many things that we're doing now, we do want to go back to in person if we can, but this is an example of something where we can be more inclusive more easily than in person. Then another point I wanted to raise is about the global reach. So I already said CEPR is mostly based in Europe, but is not only for and in Europe. Rather, our projects and also our network on the researchers and initiatives span much, much wider. And in particular, here are two big projects which CEPR is running. One is called PEDAL, and it's a grant-giving initiative for the private sector development, research on private sector development in low-income countries. And you see here from the distribution that this is going mostly to low-income countries. And similar, a new large project run by CEPR is STEG, is a 5-year academic program which grants smaller research grants, and again, mostly directed at low-income economies. So finally, and as a last point, CPR being ultimately impact oriented on top of research oriented, the P, as I already mentioned in CEPR, we also have to be more inclusive in terms of who we include in our work, in our research networks. So what I created a few years ago are the so-called research and policy networks. So these are topical networks, a bit like the working groups at the NBER, but really with the focus of a certain topic that may or may not be there for the long run. Talking, for instance, about digital currencies, central bank digital currencies. It's a topic that is maybe interesting for a number of years, but not for forever, maybe. In such kind of research networks, we have the possibility to include experts who are not fellows or affiliates of CPR, and we do very explicitly. It is some of these research networks are research and policy networks are highly active and very successful. I already mentioned the Women in Economics initiative, and then not COVID, but COVID economics. That was an initiative that we launched during the pandemic, or at the beginning of the pandemic, in order to bring relevant research to policymakers fast, but still with the quality, with a vetting process. And this was a completely open submission. As you may know, usually discussion papers of the CEPR are not open submission, but they are written by the fellows of the CEPR. But COVID economics was open submission, a highly, in my view, successful venture, both on the demand and on the supply side. It brought a lot of new, and that was one of the comments of the editor, it brought a lot of new people to the table who were publishing, who would not be coming from the usual suspects and the usual places. Last but not least, we have RoxEU, the policy platform, which is not only for CEPR, but also publishes, again, this is an open platform. It publishes research and policy relevant work from all over and is also open to submissions. So you see these different initiatives span a bit the horizon of what we are doing at CEPR. Now, if the question is, well, is it enough? And are you happy with where we are? Then the answer is no, it's not. But I'll leave the rest for the discussion. And thank you for your attention.
Thank you very much, Beatrice. Very, very useful and informative. Before we move to Rema and Penny and journals specifically, I wonder if I can ask you and Jim a question about affiliation. I mean, the most important stat is probably the most important asset that, in some sense, NBER and CEPR confer to researchers is an affiliation, a research fellow, research associate, which means that you can then submit your discussion papers, you get automatically invited to meetings in your area and so forth. Now, I know in the case of the NBER, Jim didn't mention this, but in the case of the NBER, affiliation is restricted to US-based authors, US-based researchers. Jim, you might correct me exactly what the restriction is. But in the CEPR case, as far as I know, there is not a similar restriction. At least I know I'm an affiliate. I'm certainly based in the US. So the question with respect to the CEPR is whether you've done the similar kind of tracking that you showed with respect to women representation in terms of affiliates that are outside US and Europe, and whether that's something that you would consider doing in terms of trying to broaden the reach of affiliation, somewhat along the line of the model of the COVID economics papers that you suggested, which you said you benefited from because it brought a lot of new blood. Maybe there's a room to broaden that to CPR more broadly. And for Jim, given that the NBER is engaged in so many global research activities, isn't it a little bit outmoded, the idea that it should be just US based? I mean, have you given any thought to, revisiting the Constitution, so to speak? I'm sure there are funding and other restrictions, but I would love to hear your thoughts about that. So maybe Beatrice, you want to come in first?
Yes, Dani, that's a very important point, and I think also a distinction between the two networks. So the CPR, as I have emphasized here, is not only Europe and for Europe, European and for Europe. And yes, we do track very, very clearly. And the map I showed you with the different pins, those were in part fellows. So we have quite a number of fellows like yourself who are based in the US, who are based in Asia, who are based in other places. Our criteria for appointing people who are not in Europe is that they have some link and strong interest, demonstrated interest to engage with the community, because at the end of the day, these different program areas, this has to be a lively community, and that will also mean again to meet in person, to take the time to be available for submitting not only papers but discussing papers. So be a part of the community is and demonstrating this is an important criteria for us. And definitely in the pandemic this can be done at a much wider space, geographical space than in normal times.
Yeah, and Dani, I mean, first, I want to very much agree with your comment about the increasing globalization, not just of economic research, but also of the questions that we are collectively focusing on, right? I mean, the linkages from outside domestic economies to their domestic performance seems to become increasingly important. And anyone who has watched the global supply chain challenges or just watch the impact of the pandemic as it moves from country to country and its ultimate impact on the economy sees that very clearly. I think the NBER is currently focused on North America, so it's Canada, Mexico, and the United States and primary academic affiliation. There have been many calls during my time, from researchers asking me, could we broaden the catchment, and that includes everything from moving outside the academic sector to include people who might be at the Federal Reserve or at other think tanks. Of course, the issue of expanding globally, and then if one does globally, how to do it. Well, I think that the working paper, people who are not NBER affiliates can certainly attend and participate in the conferences and the meetings, and some of the examples I gave you, I think, illustrate that. You are right that the access to the working paper series, which is certainly a very important aspect of affiliation, is restricted to the affiliates or to papers that are going to be published by the NBER in some sort of volume. So I think that you're right to put your finger on that as a place where there is a kind of constraint at the moment. My sense is that the focus on doing things with an emphasis on the North American economic setting, but being mindful of the global thing, gives us, at least at the moment, a platform for engaging many economists from around the world, but doesn't take us quite to the step of saying, do we need to change the basic rules of affiliation for the organization? In a world of unlimited resources, that might be something we could think about, but at least my experience has been that the amount of frankly, the resources available to just network economists, as opposed to do projects which are designed to, achieve a particular policy objective or intervene in a particular way, is relatively limited. And ultimately, what we're trying to do is to support a network type operation. So stretching that too thin, in my sense, might have risks of getting overly thin in terms of what could be done. So at least at the moment, I don't think that there's a major discussion around expanding, but I think very much emphasis, as I suggested at the beginning, on trying to find ways to be more inclusive and to get researchers from outside the North American context to be part of the activities that are going on. So thank you.
Thank you both. Let's move now to a discussion on journals more specifically, and we're very happy to have Rema Hanna and Penny Goldberg. Together, they have very broad experience of leading positions and editorships in journals, from AER to REStat to Journal of Human Resources and many others. So with that, let me start with Rema.
Hi, thank you for having me here today, and thank you, Dani, for organizing this. I think these are exactly the kind of conversations we should be having around diversity along a number of different dimensions. There was a few things I wanted to discuss. I'm going to start with what Dani asked me to talk on, which is the journals, and then I might diverge a little at the end to talk about some other initiatives I've been involved in that I think are very important. Because in the end, I do think, in terms of publishing and in terms of other things, it's about building networks, it's about getting your work out there, getting feedback on your work. And so all of these things are very much interconnected. On the journals, I think it's very, very important to submit and to submit multiple times and to think a little strategically as you're submitting, to look at journals where there are editors who are going to be favorable to development work, to international work is very important. Also keeping in mind there are certain journals that are trying to make a big push to diversifying outside of the US. So for example, when I was at REStat, REStat will waive the fees from authors who are at institutions abroad, at lower income countries. I think some of the AEA journals have some of these policies as well. And so I think there is a big push at the journals to get more diversity that way. I think the other reason to submit, you get feedback on your work. Another way to get connected to networks is, when I'm looking for referees for papers, trying to build my own network, because I need my own network to find referees who are experts on topics who can help with the papers. I do so in three ways. The first is I'm looking at the back of the paper, at who they cite. That's very good, but then I also get very worried that that's very networked in itself, because if you're citing certain people, it's creating a group. So then I'm trying to build my own network from conferences I've gone to, seminars, and so forth. But really, the third way I find new authors is I ask other people for lists of people that they've met at different conferences, and I particularly ask about a diverse set of referees. And I look at who submitted to the journal most recently with the same topic. And then I go to their website and look at their work and think, are they a good fit? And so I try to diversify even just the referees and the network of referees in different ways. And so getting connected to that, I think, is very important. But as I was saying at the beginning, I think it's not just, you're submitting the paper to the journals, but I think it is more than that. I think it's about, there's a lot of implicit knowledge about which journals are going to be better to submit to. There's implicit, there's even getting access to networks to get feedback on your work before you even submit, which is incredibly important. And so I do think there's two things. So first of all, I think there's got to be a broader shift in the profession in terms of thinking about sort of international work. Jim and I have had this conversation even about my own work. I work on social safety nets. I work on insurance. I work on tax. I work on environmental regulation. And I've never taken a public economics course, because when I was in graduate school, I thought public economics was the US and development was developing countries. But in the end, it's funny, I'm a public economist who's never taken public economics. And that's bad, and it's bad for the world. And so I think we should be thinking about, as we're thinking about the diversity, it's got to be beyond development and international, but being built in more systematically into the way we do teaching, into curriculum and courses and labor and public, and in lots of different topics, where it's not just examples from the US and Western Europe, but bringing in, how developing countries, where the issues are often very similar, maybe some of the institutions and the context is different, and so the problems look a little bit different, but are often fundamentally the same. And so I do think it's not just about the journals themselves, but it's about a broader shift in the profession to being more open to international work. And then the third thing I wanted to note is, I just wanted to second what Jim said about the conferences. In my own work, I'm a development economist, and I'm very committed to the idea of building links between lots of different types of researchers, and so I've done a lot of work in Indonesia, and over the years, one thing that, was very important to us is making sure that we're bringing in a diversity of researchers. And the way we've done that is, different types of conferences, and then we do matchmaking, and, we've raised money for competitive funds so we can matchmake both foreign and local researchers to come together and build research collaborations and build these kind of networks. And that are beyond just the conferences themselves. And, we've been I hope very successful in that, we brought in over about 30 Indonesian researchers and about an equal amount of foreign researchers to come together in these kind of initiatives. And I think the only way to get systematic change is to really try to build and broaden these networks. Anyways, that's all I had to say. Thank you.
Thank you, Rema. Very useful both on journals, but also more in terms of expanding networks and contacts in the countries you're working in. Penny?
Yeah. So first, thank you very much, Dani, for organizing this very interesting session. I would like to start by seconding what Jim and Beatrice said, and Rema as well, about the importance of building networks and increasing local research capacity. I think this is the level at which we can make the biggest difference. That said, I was invited here to talk about, in my capacity as previous editor of the American Economic Review, so I'm going to focus my comments on what can be done at the level of the journal, even though I think this is perhaps not the best level at which we can increase diversity globally. So let me start by stepping back for a moment and asking the question, why do we want diversity in the journals in the first place? And the most important reason, I believe, is that this makes us richer as a profession, that by considering a more diverse set of authors, we can also consider a more diverse set of questions we may not have thought as important before. And before this panel, actually, Dani, I don't know if the participants have seen that, he circulated a very interesting note he co-authored with Jacob Greenspan, where he cites Joe Stiglitz in 2001. And, Joe said, we always take the conditions under which we grew up as given. We never think twice about them, but these conditions may not apply to other settings. And by being exposed to other settings, we think of new questions. So to me, this is the number one reason journals should be more diverse. That said, I think we have made tremendous progress on that front in the last 20 years. And this has happened organically through the rise of the field of development. So development used to be just about growth and structural transformation. This way, development takes into account the local conditions of the countries that are considered. It's about health and education and political economy and institutions in general. So it's much more about growth and structural transformation. And to a certain extent, this happened because many of the authors, they may not be based in foreign countries. They're based in the US or in Europe, but they are first or second generation immigrants. And perhaps, on this panel, two of us, so Dani and I, were born in different countries. We are based in the US. We still have connections to the places we came from. Many scholars today in the US and Europe were born in low or middle income countries. That gives them a different perspective, and the kind of topics they approach are also different. So my point here is that the diversity that we see based on author affiliation may actually underestimate the diversity we have in terms of topics and even in terms of the identity of the authors. Is this perfect? No. And again, to give an example from my experience as editor of the AER, occasionally I would consult as referees people in local institutions in other countries. And you get a completely different perspective when you do that. Of course, the issue is in many cases, I didn't know whom to consult. In some cases, I happen to have private knowledge. In some cases, as Rema said, you look at the reference list in an author's paper and you realize there are people in a particular country who know a lot about these topics. But in many cases, we just don't know who would be a relevant referee. And one way to improve on that front would be to actually try to build connections with editors and editorial boards of different journals. I found visits in many different institutions across the world when I was editor very constructive. Coming back to the journals, let me talk a little bit about my experience at the AER. So starting in the 2000s, the AER was overwhelmed by the number of submissions. And I think that was an experience common across many economics journals. And this was partly driven by the transition to electronic submissions. But the main factor behind that was we started getting submissions from all over the world, from many different parts of the world. And the quality of these submissions was considerably higher than in the past. So these were not papers that we could desk reject. They were papers to be taken seriously. From the point of view of the editor, you are completely overwhelmed by the number of submissions. How are you supposed to respond? So one response at the AER, which I endorsed, was to increase the number of volumes we published. We increased the number of papers we accepted. That's a natural response. That's a first step towards addressing the fact that becoming global, taking more submissions from the rest of the world, is going to imply that we need to also accept more papers. And the fact that journals are published electronically these days allows us to do that. We are not constrained by paper. So that was one step in that direction. Another constraint at the AER, and this is very specific to the AER, is that the editors tend to be based in the US. So the constraint is not as strict as in the NBER, but I can tell you that the logistics are extremely complicated if an author is based in a country other than the United States. So naturally, editors know more about the place in which they're affiliated with. One way in which we would potentially improve on that dimension is making sure we appoint editors in other parts of the world. And again, at the AER, it may be hard to do so. After all, it's the journal of the American Economic Association, but in other economics journals, in principle, this should be possible. So that's another step in that direction. But let me finish perhaps with a somewhat different point. Ultimately, we need to think, as the world is becoming more and more interconnected, as the quality of research is increasing all over the world, we need to think why the measure of success for a scholar who lives in a different part of the world, in China or in Japan or in Europe or in Africa, why the measure of success should be a publication in the top 5. The AER, for example, that, as I said, is the Journal of the American Economic Association. So as the Journal of the American Economic Association, the AER had always had a preference towards papers that are focused on the US. For example, as editor, I accepted many papers on the healthcare system in the US. A lot of the specifics do not apply to other countries, but it was, after all, the American Economic Review. Why should an author who writes a great paper on the healthcare system in Singapore or in Japan, why should this author strive to publish in the AER? The reason people do it is because they consider, in many cases, the journals, especially the top 5 in the US, but also the other journals, to be better run than other journals in their local economies. And when this happens, then in principle, what we are asked in the journals to address a distortion that originates elsewhere. So to give you another example, I was once giving a seminar in a European country, I won't name the country, and the people in the local institution told me with pride, now we have strict promotions criteria. In order to promote people, they need to have published in the top 5 in the US. And I'm thinking, why should the measure of success in Europe, if you're in Sweden or Germany or France, that have great research institutions, why should the measure of success be whether or not you publish in the AER or in the JP or in the QJE? They should strive to publish in the best journal that are appropriate for the kind of work they do. And the promotion system in their local institutions should take that into account. So the distortion here is at the level of the institution, that the promotions is with the promotions criteria that are used. And because people often do not trust their own promotions processes, they're asking the journals in the US or in other advanced countries to do this job for them. So you are trying to address one distortion, but then introducing another distortion that puts the journals in our part of the world, in the US or in Europe, in a very difficult position because there is not space for everyone in the world. So I will stop here, and I'm sure there will be many questions. So thank you again.
Thank you, Penny. Great points. Just two brief complementary remarks. One, on the globalization of the profession. I think it's right that in many ways the economics profession has become more globalized, not just in terms of the topics it studies or the way it studies them, but in incorporating talent into the major research centers. And in some sense, you know, you, Penny, and I are the beneficiaries of this, but we are based in the United States, and Europe has absorbed a lot of talent from the rest of the world in its top institutions. So I haven't done this, but my guess is that if we look at the evolution of the national origin of top researchers or researchers in top departments, that we'll probably find that there has been increasing diversification. So in that sense, I think the profession has become more globalized. But that's not exactly the same as opening up the profession to the ideas and the contextual realities that prevail in the rest of the world. For that, I think we do need researchers whose professional life revolves around the realities and the policies and the context and the institutions of the developing world. As much as I would like to claim that I'm an economist who come from a developing country and therefore I understand developing countries, the more I live in the United States, the more distant I am. Not to say that I understand the United States any better, but still, that is not quite the same as being sort of embedded in the environment. So I think that's where we need to do a lot better. The second, really, I mean, I think, again, you emphasize, Penny, as everybody else on this panel, the importance of building networks. So the way to overcome the difficulty that we're discussing here is to improve the way that our networks function. For researchers based in the developing world, that means being able to expand their networks and access the networks. But from the perspective of the rest of us who are based in the US and Europe, that means trying to open up our networks, or at least be much more open-minded about who can and should access our networks. I think there are a lot of structural problems here. You've mentioned that, you know, as a journal editor, your first instinct is to look at the, you know, list of references. And the list of references are much more likely to want to be people who've already previously published in those journals or be based in the advanced world. So there's a kind of reinforcing cycle of how these networks get perpetuated and reinforced. There's not a magic bullet here, obviously, but I think at least we owe it to ourselves to be self-conscious about how our networks operate and to do a little bit of extra work and thinking in reaching out of that. And I think that sort of, you know, I'm hoping that this series of conversations may make a small contribution to that. We're running out of time. I wonder if any member of the panel has any reactions or amplifications or things that have already been said. But while you're thinking about that, there was one question on the chat box that I want to raise. It was addressed to Jim Poterba in particular. And I want to raise this because it connects not just to the questions that we're discussing in this panel, but to another series of discussions we're having at the International Economic Associations on US-China conflict and what the future of the global economic order would look like in the context of that. And that question, I'm sorry, I can't read the full name of the person who asked that question. First name is Wolf, but the question is, this is again to Jim Poterba, in relation to China, to what extent does the current ideological and political controversy between the US and China inhibit or taint the academic and scientific exchange between the East and the West, and whether you feel that already you know, sort of affecting the way that the NBER works, for example?
Yeah, no, and I'm glad you gave me a chance, Dani, to speak to that. And I did respond quickly in the chat, but just a second ago. I mean, at least so far, I have not seen any consequences at the level of scientific meetings between NBER researchers and researchers in China. We have a China working group that has continued, And of course, in the last 2 years, it's been operating primarily, virtually. So, those events have all gone along as before. I will say, coming at this from Cambridge, Massachusetts, where there have been episodes within the last, 18 months in which faculty members at both Harvard and MIT have been charged for having not reported ties to Chinese institutions, and it has certainly had a somewhat chilling impact there, at least in terms of making sure disclosure has been done appropriately. That's really more about the conduct of research, and I don't think that economics has quite bubbled up yet to the level of feeling that competitive secrets may be disclosed by having gatherings of economists that are exchanging ideas, and that may in some sense be a protection for some of what we do. But at least at this point, I think that the scientific networks within economics, at least that I am connected with, have continued to operate very well. And I actually would hope that they may provide a source of continuing engagement, which may actually, over time be a source of help on some of the broader issues. But simple answer would be no observable effect so far.
Great. So I just want to finish with this question to all of you. We have 3 minutes left, so just you've already addressed it, obviously, but I just want to put it in a more pointed fashion. If a researcher from a developing country comes to you and says, "Look, I have a great paper," and everybody I've talked to, including top researchers, say it's a great paper, but I just can't seem to get the profession to pay any attention to, and that might mean getting into sort of beyond the desk rejection case stage in journals, or it might be being invited to NBER or CPR conferences. So what concrete recommendations would you make to be able to access those networks to a researcher who might find himself or herself in this kind of a situation? And maybe we'll just do it in reverse order this time. I know you've addressed it, but any concrete ideas you have on this to close up our panel? Penny?
So my first reaction would be to read the paper. So as editor at the AR, I cannot tell you how many times I had letters from authors, not from developing countries, from the US, claiming they had Nobel Prize winning work that no one wanted to pay attention to. So I would read it carefully, and if there was merit to the author's claim, I would encourage her or him to present widely before submitting anywhere. So as a first step, I would try to invite them to my own institution at Yale to give a seminar in the appropriate, in the appropriate seminar, maybe development, maybe some other seminar. Then I would encourage them to submit to RED. So RED is, again, a development research network that's not based on the US alone. So they might have a better chance of being admitted to. Perhaps the NBER as well. So the NBER also has conferences that are open to a much broader audience. So I would very strongly encourage this researcher to try to engage in a marketing strategy before they submit to journals. And I would say that more broadly to anyone who tries to submit to journals, when you submit completely anonymously, it's very, very tough.
Rema, any thoughts?
No, so I agree with Penny on reading the paper and also trying to present more widely. And in addition to the RED and the NBER, there's lots of really great conferences, both in the US and abroad. Like the ISI in India, runs a fantastic conference, and a lot of people are there. And there's just lots of great places. For example, I know that one because I work in India, but there's lots of great conferences around the world that people should be presenting to. I think the other thing is that in addition, I agree on the invitations. I do think one challenge, even at Harvard, we're very lucky with a lot of funding, is a lot of issues is, money for seminars to invite international speakers are often, the budgets are small. And, one conversation, if we do want to try to build these networks, is actually throwing a little bit of resources at it, so it makes it easier to try to bring people into these kind of networks as well. So that's the other thing I would note.
Thank you, Rema. Beatrice?
Well, I have the same reaction as Rema and Penny, that the first step is to read, but the second step then is to think about what are the possible attachment points, presentation points. And at CEPR, typically, we do have a lot of, there is really no lack of conferences, workshops, and possibilities for non-CEPR fellows to participate, to present. And again, as I was saying before, the virtual world has probably increased these opportunities rather than decreased them. And I will be keen that we keep those things of the new virtual world that have worked going forward, even as we go back to more in person. And by the way, it's cheap. That there is no argument about resources except for our time, which is always expensive.
Thank you, Beatrice. Jim, last word.
Yeah, I mean, the read the paper is, of course, the first answer, and I very much, endorse that as the starting point. And of course, if I felt I could make a judgment of whether this was good research or important research, I might then try to take action and reach out to one of the program directors and say, look, this looks pretty interesting, have a look. But the other thing I would point out is, the mathematics of networks and graph theory tells you, you don't just go to one point on the graph and try there. So I would also come back and say, don't necessarily just write to Penny as the editor of the AER. Why don't you start with someone who's closer to you, but who is more connected to the network than you are, right? I'm imagining this is a newly minted PhD who thinks they have a terrific paper that was their job market paper, but they can't get traction with it. Find someone who is a more senior member of your domestic network or other groups that you can connect to, who will spend the time looking at your paper. And then if they deem this to in fact be really the next really important piece of work, they will reach out and they will write to Rema or they will write to Penny and say, my junior colleague has this terrific paper. Because I do think that if the letter comes with some additional endorsement to it from someone who is already part of the network, that actually will carry more weight in giving some opportunity to bring this new person in. And I think, a final thought, Dani, that I think is important for all of us, whether editor or network manager, is inverting that observation, which is to say, we need to really be thinking as we are trying to build our networks, whether it's domestic or international or global, right? If you have a network which is very compact and it doesn't have many nodes that link out to places where you're trying to build, you're not going to find the talent that you're trying to bring in. So one thing that I've discovered at the NBER is that the diversity initiatives tend to have a force multiplier effect. When you first get a few people into the network who are not part of your traditional network, they bring other people to your attention. And that's really important, right? So I think that's a dynamic that we should just all be aware of. And it does suggest that precisely convening these kind of discussions like you've had today to remind us all to think about that, I think is really very important. So I think it's a great note to close on. Thank you.
Thank you, wonderful. And that's very useful advice. So what I am hearing is reach out to somebody who knows you, but who's a little bit more closely connected or more centrally located in the network. Then present as at many conferences as you can, and then submit to new journal, and that's really the process. So with that, let me really thank you, all the panelists, Jim, Beatrice, Rema, Penny, for taking part in this conversation. I really appreciate, and I think some of the concrete suggestions you've made are very, very useful. And look forward to seeing and hearing from all of you on our next session. Thanks again, and have a wonderful day. Bye-bye.